So can I get a set of hands? Who of you knows what multisite is? That looks good. Who of you knows what multi-network is? Yeah, so I'm going to talk about what multi-network is today and how you can organize it. So I'm going to give, first of all, a brief introduction on what it is, and look at some use cases. I'm going to talk about the basics of how it internally works. Then we're going to have a brief look together at how it is supported by WordPress core, or how it is not so well supported by WordPress core. And of course, we're going to look at how to actually make use of multi-network. And eventually, the main point of this talk is going to be like how to manage, how to get deeper into multi-network organization, particularly to regarding global scope. So what is multi-network? It's essentially multiple multi-sites in one setup. So you may be, when you're familiar with multi-site, you create basically one network. So in other words, multi-network is simply multiple networks, which also is based on the thought that multi-site is a single network. So each network essentially has its own set of sites. So it's basically a way to group sites together, but it allows so much more than that. It's not just a way to group sites. You can have different functionality for each different network. For example, you can have network-activated plugins, network-enabled themes. All the stuff you might know from multi-site already, they still stay per network. So where you in a multi-site have network-activated plugins, they basically affect all of your WordPress setup. In a multi-network, they only affect the network for which they are set. So looking at use cases, this is a project that I worked on. It's basically about a music event and festival producer, and they have a multi-network where they're basically set up in a way that they have a main network which contains only one site, which is the main website of the producer and all the regular local events that they have. It also has a huge database of artists and genres and that kind of stuff. And then they have a separate network containing festival websites, because they run like 8 to 10 festivals a year, and every festival has its own website. And all those festival websites, though, they are really similar in terms of functionality. They just have different designs all the time, but they need the same functionality, so it makes sense to logically group them in their own network. And then again, what also makes sense there, it's still good to have them in the same environment than the main the main website, because it has a common user base, and also, for example, when you have a specific artist show up at a festival, that data can then be pulled from the main site where all that artist data is already present. And there's also a third network for partner websites, so that's basically this setup. Another common user of multi-network are universities. Like here is the example of Washington State University, where Jeremy and Stephen are maintaining it, and we also listened to Ashley this morning, who does the same for Boston University. Basically, when you think about a university, it's a very complex hierarchy. There, you can basically think about each faculty maybe having its own network, and then each faculty then also having many sites, such as for individual classes or projects. And then you can even go beyond that, maybe create a separate network that is for student sites, where students can create their own sites. So multi-network makes sense there, because you can have a very granular management, more than you could with just having one network with housing all the sites all together. Another rather weird example, but something we all know, is WordPress.com. So to my knowledge, I don't work for Automatic, but to my knowledge, WordPress.com has 2 networks, and one of them is for actual WordPress sites, WordPress.com sites, and the other one is basically mirroring Jetpack sites. So this is a very common use case. I don't have any more background, a very custom use case, I don't have any more background information on what they need to do, but you may already think about like Jetpack sites will definitely work completely differently. They need to be handled differently than regular WordPress.com sites. So let's look at how it actually works, what the concept looks like. When we look at a regular WordPress setup, it's simply a single site. It has posts, comments, terms, themes, plugins, users, settings, everything that we're probably familiar with. So here again, the database schema, all these tables for all the aforementioned content types, including meta tables for arbitrary data associated with a certain content item. And that changes when we set up multisite. When we set up multisite, in other words, when we set up a network, basically you create a network and then you can create multiple sites. Initially, we'll simply have one site, but you can create further ones. And each one of those sites has then their own set of the mentioned database tables. But there are also additional tables for a multi-site organization for the network level. However, this is not the whole truth. There's something missing, which we get to in just a bit. But first of all, let's look at the database schema again. These are the tables basically that belong to a single site, and you basically replicate them for each site. Not content-wise, but you can replicate the database schema, essentially. So if you have, and basically all the sites, all the tables, as long as they're not the main site, they're prefixed with the ID of each site. So for example, if you have site ID 2, like in the example on the right here, you would use the base prefix and then the site ID, which is 2, and that will be the prefix so that you can so that you don't run into conflicts. Something you may notice though is that in this list, the user table and the user meta table, they are no longer part of this, and that's because once you set up multi-site, they are no longer site related. So they become global tables, which a good example for is in WordPress.org and all the sites and networks that are part of WordPress.org, because WordPress.org is also a multi-network. Everywhere on these sites you can log in with your same user credentials, and that's because the user credentials are part of that global table. They are not stored per site. And then we get to look at the network database tables, the multi-site specific tables. First of all, we have block versions, registration log, and sign-ons. Those are somewhat utility tables that we won't look at for now. But it leaves us with the WP blocks table, then WP site, and WP users. So WP blocks is the table that contains the different sites and the information about the different sites of our setup. WP site contains the network definition, and this may seem really weird, but the naming is because of legacy reasons, because back in the day, what we call a site today used to be called a blog, and what we call a network today used to be called a site, and especially with a site, it is kind of unfortunate. But yeah, we have to live with these table names for now, and probably forever. Anyway, so users, of course, users, they manage the users, and that table is again taken over from the regular setup. It will forever only exist once. It will not be duplicated like the other single site tables. But now we get to the interesting part. As you see, there is a WP site table that stores network definition. Because it's a database table, it can actually store multiple networks, information from multiple networks. So if you set up a regular multi-site, you will forever only have one entry in there. It will also likely not change unless you change the domain or path of your network. But generally, it will forever contain one entry unless you set up multiple networks, unless you get into a multi-network. So you can have multiple networks. It's hidden, but it's possible. It's basically enabled by this database schema, because also the WP site meta table, which stores what we commonly know as network settings, it's just, like, as you can already see by the name maybe, it's actually technically a metadata table, where the data is associated with a specific network ID. So that means we can have as many networks as we want, and all the settings will be part of the site meta table associated with that network's ID. So that works as well. So when we look at an actual multi-network setup, as you can see, we can have multiple networks. These networks can have sites. But then there's also something called that we commonly refer to as global scope. And that really only becomes important when having multiple networks. It's, for example, to manage things that go beyond a network, like who can create networks? That should not be possible for every network administrator. There needs to be some kind of higher level in the hierarchy. And again, like users, they are already global entities. So that is even where core itself obviously uses global scope. Users are not per network, users are global. It doesn't really matter for you in a regular multi-site because you only have one network. So in that case, a network is essentially the same, almost the same, like global. But when you have, once you have multiple networks, you have to think about what's global, what's network. So users are global entities in WordPress. Networks are also global entities. And even sites are, from a database schema, global entities. But they're all, each of them is associated always with the network. So that means they're arranged in a way that we consider them being a lower level in the hierarchy than a network. So there are no network-specific database tables in WordPress. Everything is either global or per site. So when we get back to our regular multi-site setup as a second try, because the first one was incomplete, global scope is there as well. It's just nothing you really need to worry about usually because it's, like I said, it's the same as a network. So looking at WordPress core and how it supports multi-network, as we have already seen, the database schema supports it. We can have multiple networks easily with WP Site and WP Site meta database table. Code-wise, it's a little less supported, but what we have is WP network class and representing a network and WP network query so that you can even query networks by arbitrary data like their domain and path and that kind of stuff. So yeah, and then we also have network administration panels. So again, in a regular multi-site, you have just the one network admin. But once you have multiple networks, all these networks have separate network admin panels. Well, the list of what WordPress lacks in support is unfortunately a little bit longer. There's no really API, there's no API in core to create or update or delete networks. Again, the R from the CRUD is supported by having the WP network and WP network query classes. More importantly, even for people even knowing that exists, there's no UI. There's no UI for managing any of that in WordPress. And then there are small, trivial things that are not supported very well. Like, for example, you may be familiar with switch to block, where you can switch context in a multi-site to another site. There's no way to do such thing for a network. There's no switch to network function or something like that. But a lot of what's lacking is also dependent on how what you consider essential for your multi-network setup. So maybe you would want to have globally enabled themes or globally activated plugins too, like that kind of stuff. If that's what you need, like it would also be lacking. So there's a lot of work that you need to do when working with multi-network. But when you want to use it, the probably recommended way to get started is to install a plugin called WP Multi-Network. It's been maintained by John James Jacoby. And when you install that plugin, you basically get the full CRUD API functions for WordPress, so you can do cool stuff as a developer. You get a UI, as you may see here, like you have in the network admin, it will show a network area, and yeah, you can manage the networks there. It also introduces that function I just mentioned, switch to network, so you can switch network context. But still, WP multi-network is just a very basic foundation of getting started with multi-network. So usually, like pretty much most of the times, you would want to tweak things here or there to make them work in the way you want them to. There are other ways to do this, though. You don't need to use WP multi-network if you're a little more, I want to code it myself, that kind of person. For example, well, Washington State University has done that. They also have a plugin that handles multi-network functionality. But multi-network is, I guess, it's just the most popular plugin. And popular means not very popular because multi-network is still very edge case. So what kind of problems do we face once we have just simply installed WP multi-network? We might face this problem. Usually, it probably doesn't make sense that you allow every network administrator to create new networks. But that is what happens when you just install WP multi-network. The menu for that appears in the network admin, and every network administrator can create new networks. So you would want to use the higher level in hierarchy, so it should probably be something that happens in global scope. So this is the first area where I personally figure like, oh, we probably need something else here, like something higher. So let's think about network administrators. They can create sites. That's the case today. But only what we could refer to as global administrators, only those should be able to create networks. So how do we deal with this? How do we work with global scope in a multi-network? There are essentially two alternatives that we've been thinking about. The first approach could be to use WordPress just as before, but store global data in the main network. And then we could also use the main network admin as a global dashboard. This means that basically all the UI is available. We just need to hook in some filters all over WordPress to make things apply globally instead of just for the main network. If you go with that approach, you would probably want the main network to be some kind of empty, like on the front end, you wouldn't really want to have anything. All the actual sites should then live in other networks. So that's what an easy implementation of the global network through the network admin could look like. However, the second alternative would be to actually go with implementing a global administration panel, which sounds like a logical and more organized approach, but it requires, I guess, a deep dive into how multisite works, and you also have to work around several limits because WordPress doesn't support having an additional administration panel. So, as the slides say, I consider the first variant a conceptual hack because you misuse the network admin as the global admin, but the second solution is a technical hack because you just have to completely hack around WordPress shortcomings in terms of enabling a global administration panel. So we're going to look at these two things. If you want to use the main network for a global scope functionality, that's what Washington State University does, and they have open sourced their code for this. So global data is stored in network settings for the main network. Global administrators, they are simply network administrators on the main network, but then their capabilities are applied so that they automatically become administrators everywhere. So that's what global means here. And then global UI, it's simply there because WordPress provides it. And again, it misuses the network administration panel, but it ties in well with the existing WordPress functionality. The alternative, I've been working on plugins that try to implement the global admin as an actual separate admin interface. So when you look at the images, it will be a completely separate admin. So you will have in the admin bar, you can see it says network admin, but then you will also have global admin separately from that. And then in that case, global data could be stored in a new database table, something like global options. Global admins are then stored as a global setting, similar to how network administrators are stored in network settings today. Well, and global UI is available in an entirely new global administration panel, and that's the hacky part. Like, believe me, the code in that is ugly, really ugly. Well, it behaves like existing WordPress functionality, but you need to hack around like crazy. So, and yeah, both of these, they basically rely on WP Multi-Network for the base functionality, where the WSU plugin, it includes everything. So you would get we get a full package there, where here you would have to use three different plugins. But anyway, so those are examples of how you could do it. But the exact details, they all depend on how you're gonna approach this. You might also code all of it yourself. Another problem that we face in multi-network by default is that network administrators, they can see all users on the entire setup. Because a network admin screen, it lists all users that are there. It doesn't list the users in the current network. And the problem is there isn't even a way to figure out which networks a user belongs to, because this is not stored anywhere. You have associations between a user and their sites that they're a member of, that they have a role in, but not for networks. So I guess to make that even possible to list users per network, we need to store that association somehow. If you wanted to do it without it, you could want to try to write code to run a ridiculous meta query that checks for all site IDs that the network has, and then you could do a meta query with hundreds of join queries, possibly. Like, it doesn't work. So you actually need to store associations between users and the network. And the simple way to do that would be to simply store network IDs as user metadata. The alternative, which is pretty much similar, would be to store an empty capabilities array under the capability keys for that network. This is exactly how single-site capabilities work, so capabilities for a site work, and how they are stored for users. So it's a similar approach, but it's a little more future-proof in case we would want to have network roles in some point in the future. So I'd suggest simply going with the second. And that's also what both of these variants do. So both the WSU plugin and I've been working on network roles plugin. They both implement that in a way, and they both implement that in the way that once you add a user to a site, for example, that user is automatically also assigned to that network. And if it hooks in certain places in WordPress core, so that when you remove the user from a site and that user is no longer part of any site in the network, they're also removed from the network, unless they're a network administrator. So just a short disclaimer, while these plugins here are used in production environments, they're still very custom, and especially because some of it is quite hacky, they should be used with care. So if you're interested, which I'd be very happy to get feedback on both of these approaches, please really try them out on development sites for quite a bit before you just push them out to your production environment. And now we're just going to have a brief look at what the future of multi-network can look like. So the current idea, what we think that it will probably never happen that WordPress will have an UI for multiple networks. It's simply too much of an edge case, and how it's used varies way too much across all the different setups. So it should remain plugin territory. However, the very basic CRUD API part, that should be part of core. It should be unopinionated, and this will be introduced for networks, maybe even including REST API support, although we're not entirely sure. But the regular CRUD API, like WP insert network, that kind of stuff, we probably have it in core maybe by end of this year or sometime next year. Never know, but it will come to core. And then also we want to introduce hooks and fix bugs wherever these multi-network implementations out there could want to hook in. to basically improve support, not by actually adding something, but by enabling the plugins to do what they need to do in order to accomplish their goals. So if you have one of these larger projects to manage where you think multi-network may make sense, or you're already using it, we'd be happy to have feedback. For core, if you want to integrate in some place where it doesn't work, come join our core meetings for multisite, or try out one of these plugins and see which shortcomings you see there. I'm happy to chat about this further. If you're interested, I'll be here for the rest of the day. So please hit me up later. Also hit me up if you want to have some very sugary and sour German candy. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you.
We do have a few more minutes for questions. If anybody has questions about the projects Felix is working on or any of the stuff from his presentation.
All right. Thank you very much for that talk. Quick question about backing up. So on a network basis, there are plugins now that enable one to back up a site at a time. When you're talking about multi-network, is there an approach? I'm doing something similar to that right now. Is there an approach you would recommend for that kind of thing where you're slicing up either a network at a time or something? How do you go about backing up this kind of data set?
That is a good question. I honestly don't have an answer for you right now. Like it's hard. We would still use a plugin that does that per site for the individual sites. I personally haven't worked on a setup like the university setup that has thousands of sites. So you may ask that question to some of the people who are here. But what I've been doing, we've still always, it was always a manageable amount of sites. So we have still done that separately, basically.
That was my own fault. I walked up.
So what advice would you give for people who maybe already have existing multi-sites that are separate and they just learned about, site networks and they want to go to this global state? Is there a good migration path to bring two together?
It would be fairly complex. I mean, there's no tool to do that as far as I know. But you could generally take over the site-specific tables for the most part, and I guess most of that would still work, but you would need to adjust the table IDs because, well, the site IDs wouldn't work together. So there's no I don't know about any tool that does this. But yeah.
So WP Migrate DB Pro is going to put that on the roadmap. Sometime in April, we can expect that. Thanks, Pete. Appreciate you.
That's great.
Anybody else? All right. Thank you, Felix.
Thank you.